So once upon a time, around 2,500 years ago, in a place which is today called China, but was not then called China, there was born a seemingly unremarkable lad named Kung. His father, a low-level aristocrat with good political connections. Aristocrats are different. But his father was a low-level aristocrat with good political connections, and he died when Kung was only 3. So Kung was raised by his mother. He attended the schools for commoners, where he discovered at age 15 a singular passion for learning and study. And out of his studies, he developed his own peculiar ideas for how people ought to live and govern themselves, although he did not think any of his ideas were particularly original. Some of these ideas included things like, the gentleman comprehends according to what is right, but the small man understands according to what is profitable. Or, do not be concerned that no one recognizes your merits. Be concerned that you may not recognize the merits of others. And then there is this tired old chestnut in answer to the question of what is the one rule to live by in life. Kung said, do not do unto others what you do not wish done unto you. As a young man, Kung traveled around China making a living as a teacher of the adult children of aristocrats, and gradually he acquired a retinue of loyal followers who listened to his peculiar ideas and eventually wrote them down. And then sometime after his death, his ideas became the dominant shaping force in Chinese culture, for the next 2,500 years or so. Right, in the West, we know him as Confucius, which is a Latinized version of Kung Fu Tse, which just means Master Kung. The appearance of Confucianism on the world stage is part of a remarkable intellectual and spiritual flowering in world civilization that took place from around 600 to 400 BCE. Over the span of just a few centuries, all over the world, and largely completely independently of one another, almost all of the major world religions sprang into existence or underwent tremendous revitalization, often at the behest of a great prophet or teacher. In Persia, there was Zoroaster. In Greece, there was Socrates. In China, there was Confucius and also Lao Tse, who founded Taoism. In India, the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita were written at this time, and the Buddha lived and taught. In Israel, there were the prophets, Isaiah and Ezekiel, and their ideas about justice not only became central to Judaism, but centuries later would be echoed and amplified in the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. This awakening is so striking that many historians call it the axial age. It was the birth of a new ethical vision for civilization happening spontaneously all around the world. Now, in December, it is often the tradition at UUI to spend our time for all ages with the children telling the birth stories of multiple wise men, which we did this month, including Jesus, Buddha, and Confucius. The idea of telling the different birth stories in parallel comes from the work of a UU religious educator named Sophia Lyon-Fahs, one of the great founding religious educators who did most of her work in the 1940s and 50s. And she believed it was important to educate children in the religious traditions of the world so that they could see some of the underlying commonalities that unites them. One of the great examples, of course, was Confucius's golden rule, do not do unto others what you do not want done unto you, which is found in some variation in almost all of the world's great traditions. Fahs wanted children to understand, and we teach here at UUI, of course, that wisdom was not a monopoly of the Judeo-Christian faith or the Judeo-Christian tradition, and that every religious tradition has a vision of peace and harmony that has something to teach humanity. In this season, when the universal human aspiration for peace is so often lifted up in our public language, I thought we would talk just a little bit about these teachers whose birth stories we have been sharing all month, and what we have to learn from them about making peace. So Master Kung, Confucius, lived at a time when the need for peace was a gripping social question. It was the pressing social question because The central authority of the powerful Zhou kingdom, which had existed, had collapsed in the time of his life due to invasions. And this left just a small host of provinces that were fighting amongst themselves, trying to seize power. So warfare and civil war was the constant of his era. It was a period of tremendous violence and instability. And Confucius's response to this chaos was to propose that a world of peace and harmony could be created through education of each person in proper virtue. This is actually a very Unitarian idea, right? Like 2,000 years later, in the 19th century, the great William Ellery Channing believed in what he called salvation by character, which was a different flavor of the same idea. It trusted that humans were basically good, humans were basically rational, and through education and the cultivation of virtue, we could live in harmony with one another, right? Both traditions, Unitarianism and Confucianism, emphasize that individualism is best lived in community. For Confucius, people are practically defined by their network of relationships. That doesn't mean that the individual doesn't exist or isn't important, but it recognizes that we do not exist in isolation, but rather our self develops precisely as we experience life through our relationships. So in my case, for example, I experience life as a son, as a younger brother, as a neighbor, as a father, as a husband, as a friend, as an American, as a member of this community, and so on, right? So if you were to strip away all of these relationships from who I am, what you would have left would just be an abstraction, not a living, breathing, feeling person who is actually me. So Confucius believed, in a strong sense, we are our relationships, and that we should cultivate as the highest priority an inward state of humane feeling and sort of good-heartedness towards other people. And he called this concept Ren. Cultivating Ren is a lifelong process of learning to be more human, he said. He believed we learn about Ren in the family, and then we learn about it with our neighbors, and then outward in expanding circles. Now, the outward expression of Ren for Confucius was Li, which is a word that means sort of like appropriate or respectful behavior. It's correct behavior. It's showing good form in how we do things, right? It applies to how we treat people, animals, the earth, even common objects. Confucius believed all of creation was worthy of Li. And this is another place where Confucianism and Unitarianism intersect, because we also believe that daily life is sacred and that all aspects of this earth are an expression of a divine that is to be honored and is worthy. So when a Confucian pours a cup of tea with Li, with correctness, with respect, she's not only showing respect for herself and the person she's pouring for, but for the tea itself, for the cup, for the whole world of being and objects, towards which our appropriate attitude is reverence. So it is a way of bringing that reverence into all of our actions. Now, Kung believed that if you had a well-ordered kingdom that stressed this education and family, and everyone behaved with this humane reverence and expressed Li, then this would be a kingdom of peace. It would have to be. And if the king was virtuous and the king had this Ren and Li, then the people would be virtuous. So he traveled all over the land attempting to gain the ear of this ruler or that ruler so he could institute his ideas about politics, a politics of virtue. And mostly he failed. And he failed because the rulers were really happy to hear this idea that the subjects should be loyal, but really unhappy to hear this idea that the rulers should be virtuous. Now, the classic application of Confucianism to this vision of social harmony is one that most UUs would probably have a problem with. So Kung emphasized, and Confucianism emphasizes, hierarchies of duty, loyalty, and service. And he named 5 of these sort of basic hierarchies between like ruler and subject, husband and wife, parent and child, and then I think siblings and friends. But this is a very patriarchal system. I leave you to guess in the husband and wives hierarchy who comes out on top, right? It's all built around hierarchies and duties and rules. And, as Unitarian Universalists, we tend to not like hierarchies and duties and rules. That's not our instincts. But we do stress our interconnectedness and our need for one another and our desire to build loving community as something that we embrace and celebrate. What I think Confucianism challenges Unitarian Universalists to think about more deeply in a good way is precisely our accountability to one another and to our community. Our individuality is something to be cherished, but how do our individual actions impact the community? Do they contribute to harmony? Do they promote mutual respect? Do they help to make all people feel valued even as we meet our own needs? So peace, Confucius believed, begins in the heart and the home, and it lives in the respect that we show one another in ways big and small. And I think we can all agree that we are in a cultural moment where respect is hard to come by. Respect for one another shown in all of our actions is thin on the ground, especially if you've ever been on a thing called the internet. Now, the Buddha also taught that peace is something that begins within. Unlike Confucius, Buddha was not focused directly on the problem of violence. He was focused on the larger problem of human suffering, which he thought was the root cause of violence. And the Buddha identified suffering as rooted in our desire for permanence in a universe where everything changes. Everything changes. We watch our bodies grow old. We love knowing that our loved ones must someday die, knowing that we too must someday pass away. And every moment is lived knowing that all of this will never be the same again. And so the Buddha counseled us to accept the changing nature of all things and to find a deep peace in that acceptance. And this is sometimes expressed as the idea of non-attachment, of a letting go of our attachment to things that we know are going to change anyway. And there can be a tension here with Unitarian Universalism because Unitarian Universalism challenges us to grow in love and interdependence, which is to say Unitarian Universalism encourages us to be attached in a certain way, to be ever more deeply attached to the world and its inhabitants throughout our life. So how does a Unitarian Universalist understand non-attachment as a goal? And what Buddhism would say, I believe, is that non-attachment never means that we don't care. It doesn't mean that we're indifferent to the things in our lives. Non-attachment is not the opposite of love. Non-attachment is the opposite of fear. It is the opposite of fear. So non-attachment means we live our lives without clinging to our life. We allow good things to come into our life and we give ourselves over to them wholeheartedly, but we do so knowing and accepting that they will pass away. Non-attachment doesn't mean we don't experience grief. It means we accept our grief. We let it into our life as a wandering visitor, knowing that this too will pass. In this way, we don't wall ourselves off from our own life, the good and the bad of it, out of self-protection. And it is precisely non-attachment, the Buddhist would say, that allows us to love, that allows us to love more fearlessly and more deeply than we had imagined. Non-attachment, paradoxically, allows us to say yes to life in a profound way, with a great deal of playfulness and abandon, knowing that this too will pass, but cherishing every moment for that reason. And it is non-attachment, bringing this idea back around to peace. It is this loving fearlessly that allows us to respond to other people with kindness and compassion and peace. Because it's fear of loss that causes us to seek to control and dominate, trying to hold on to things. It is this need to hold on and control a given outcome that causes us to act with violence. Buddhism, like Confucianism, would say peace begins within, when we've let go of our need for control and we focus on cultivating kindness and compassion. Now, Buddhism has sometimes been criticized as being overly focused on the enlightenment of the individual and the individual's release from suffering to the exclusion of concern about social justice. So maybe you know the classic Beatles song Revolution, when John Lennon sings, "You tell me it's the institution, well, you know, you better free your mind instead." Right? Free your mind, man. But what happens to someone who frees their mind but nonetheless remains oppressed by society or the government or racism or war? What responsibility do we have to free their person as well as their mind, or to transform institutions? So enter the Hebrew prophets into our axial age, Isaiah, Ezekiel, and the others. For the Hebrew prophets, peace was all about transforming institutions, to reflect what they saw as the intention of God, that people live in covenantal relationships of mutual care, which sounds like a vaguely Unitarian Universalist idea to me, covenantal relationships of mutual care. And the prophets sharply criticized what they saw as the exploitation of the poor and the wanderer and the widow in their own time. Which brings us to our third great teacher of peace, whose birth story we've been celebrating this month, Jesus of Nazareth. When we think of Jesus and peace, specifically peace, we often think of images of the birth story, right, of like this baby in a manger, and it's very pastoral. There's shepherds, there's like a lamb, there's pretty lights and singing. And it conjures up all of these images of like innocence and vulnerability. And the most famous teaching of Jesus related to peace is probably turn the other cheek, which can be interpreted as an injunction to pacifism. Jesus says, become like little children if you want to enter into the kingdom of heaven. So again, this vulnerability. And so when we think about Jesus and peace, there can be this aura of sort of passivity and gentleness. There's a song that gets played a lot this time of year called Mary, Did You Know? Does anyone know this song? The narrator in the song is singing to Mary, and he's asking her, like, Mary, did you know this baby you're carrying? He's going to walk on water. He's going to heal the people. He's going to save humanity, and on and on. Mary, did you know this and that? Obviously reflecting a contemporary Christian theology about Jesus, but also someone described this song to me as basically the singer is mansplaining Christ to the mother of Christ. Well, interestingly enough, Mary did know. And in fact, she has her own song that she sings about the baby that she is carrying. Right, in the Gospel of Luke, in the first chapter, before we get to the birth story with the manger and the angels and the shepherds and all of that, when Mary finds out that she's pregnant with Jesus, she sings a song about it. A very famous song called the Magnificat. All right, this is Mary's song, and I'm going to read it to you. This is the NRSV translation. Mary sings, "My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior, for he has looked with favor on the lowliness of his servant. Surely from now on all generations will call me blessed, for the Mighty One has done great things for me, and holy is his name. His mercy is for those who fear him from generation to generation. He has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. He has helped his servant Israel in remembrance of his mercy, according to the promise he made to our ancestors, to Abraham and to his descendants forever." What is so interesting about this to me is that Mary here, who is often cast in the story in this very passive role, right at the very beginning has assumed the mantle of the prophets. She is a prophetess. And she is using the language of the prophets straight out of that axial age tradition. Because what she's talking about, what she is announcing as the meaning of her son's ministry, is taking down the system. What does she talk about in that imagery? The powerful are knocked right off their thrones. The proud are scattered. The poor are fed and the lowly are lifted up. But the rich, who in that day, it would have been axiomatic, were exploiters by definition, the rich are sent away empty. So it's a really powerful vision, and it's not about lambs and gentleness per se. It is about justice. It is about justice. The Christian vision of peace lifted up by Mary reminds me, if anything, of Dr. King's insistence that peace, first and foremost, must mean justice. Dr. King called out the three evils of war, racism, and poverty, and said there can be no true peace without the establishment of justice, which means ending war and racism and poverty. And like the Hebrew prophets, here in this Song of Mary, we have the language that evokes the message that Jesus himself would preach, also from the prophets, that justice means more than just changing hearts and minds. Justice means changing institutions. It means radically rearranging the landscape. The powerful are not just reformed in this vision, they are knocked off their thrones. So this particular vision of Christianity makes room for righteous anger in its insistence on the peace of justice. So when we think of the Christmas story, we're talking about one of the most radical messages of social change ever announced. And it's right there in Mary's song. Yes, she did know. All these visions of peace have echoes in Unitarian Universalism. We believe in the cultivation of education and humane character as the foundation for living together in harmony, right? Knowledge and virtue is precious to us. We believe that our lives are best lived out in relationships of mutual accountability and interdependence. We believe that compassion and kindness are practices that begin within and should shape how we treat each other in every moment of our lives. And we believe that peace without justice is incomplete, and that love calls us not just to change our hearts, but to change the world. So in this season of peace, I invite you to reflect with gratitude on the words and deeds of all of the world's teachers of peace, from the great to the humble, to be open to the message of peace, however it should find its way into our hearts and minds, and to have the courage to live it out in making real change in the world. May we each find a path to bring more peace into our lives and into the world. Blessed be, and amen.